Recording in progress.
This is Janine with Pool Zones, and the purpose of the video today is to discuss the infinity edge or negative edge and the type of material that should be used for the infinity edge. Now, this is a very favorite tile of mine. It is Light Streams. It comes from California, and it is a beautiful iridescent glass tile and one of the actual best on the market. But I'd like to discuss the different types of materials, and first of all, the edge. What does an infinity or a negative edge need for material? What happens to the edges during construction? In other words, what is possibly going to go wrong? And how to know whether the edge is level during construction, and what can be done if it is unlevel. So we see here different materials. This is a lot of these photos will be from Lou Aiken's collection, which is part of the actual package in terms of learning about negative edge pools. Now, this particular one here has, you can see it has calcium that is coming through the actual grout, and this will indicate a much deeper problem. But let us just continue on past that subject for now. This here is basically the style of the pool has a lot of rock on it. So with the rock on an infinity edge, it is impossible, or would be near impossible, to use this sort of material to make this edge level. And yet this edge must be level to gain the infinity look. So obviously Lou Aikens, in this particular example, chose to use glass here on the infinity edge. So this is actually the pool beam, which was slanted to create this sloped edge and to also preserve or integrate the stone with the design. One thing that you will notice about many of the Lou Aikens infinity pools is that the basin, it has a very decent depth to it. Now this pool is under construction, or was under construction at the time. We used the Light Streams glass. It looks very dull here. What gives it its beautiful iridescence is, of course, the sun. So in this situation here, we used a 1/2 inch travertine or limestone tile along the infinity edge, and there is a very good reason for that. So we use glass along here, but on the edge you can see is the 1/2 inch limestone tile. Why did we choose to use 1/2 inch limestone tile instead of using the glass? I'm going to answer that in a few moments. Now, in moving into the next photo here, we see again the travertine. And what we see under construction, so keep in mind, we're still constructing, we've waterproofed the pool, and we fill the pool during construction. So it does not have the interior surface, and it still has several phases until it's completed. But what we want to try out or test out is a flood test to see how is the edge, is it level? The only way to really find out whether this edge is level is to actually fill the pool. We did put a level on this, and it didn't indicate that it was unlevel. But once we filled it, we found that one side was actually lower than the other side. You see here on this side, you can actually see the edge here of the stone, which indicates that this side is higher up. Then when we came to this side over here, we were starting to see the floating cap, which is closer to the top of the edge. And it was unlevel. So what the tiler needed to do is he needed to go back out there and to grind down the higher part of this limestone. Now, let's talk about the flood test. So we flood tested it mainly to make sure it held water, and secondly, to make sure that the edge was actually level. So I'm going to show you now a completely different pool, which is one of Lou Aiken's zero edge pools. And unfortunately, this video of the pool construction was removed from the YouTube channel, and it was 28 videos of Lou Aikens describing the different phases of constructing this pool. Now, if you notice here, and I'm going to divert briefly, notice where he puts the pool equipment. It's always going to be down toward the lower side of the pool and not the upper side. So, and the reason for that is it's going to be better performance if the pool equipment is lower, because it's going to be very easy to prime any of these pumps. But any pumps that are up on the higher level and maybe much further back will be very difficult to prime. Not impossible, but more difficult to prime. So what we see with this particular project, we want to talk about the edge. What is it? What happens to the edges during construction? How to know whether the edge is level, and what can be done when it is not level. So while we see glass tile, now this is an infinity edge around the entire pool. And while we see glass tile, that does not necessarily indicate that they just put glass tile onto the concrete or onto the foundation, whatever that was. In this situation, it's concrete, gunite. What happened here is going back to our comment earlier about the travertine or the limestone. They actually used limestone here. So they took large pieces of 24 by 12 limestone, and they allowed for this in construction to actually put the limestone 1 inch thick around this entire edge. And what they did with the limestone is in installing it right around this entire edge, again, there's an allowance for that in the calculations. They were able to then fill the pool, and then they did what I mentioned earlier, is that they went around the entire pool, and whatever area was higher was then, using an angle grinder, was ground down to the level and area. So that's the only way to achieve such perfection here with the level. Now, after they did that, and after they validated and verified that it was perfectly level with the limestone, this is travertine, so this was not used. It was a 1 inch limestone, beautiful limestone material that you will never see. It was once they did that, then they established a perfectly level base. Consider that for a moment. A perfectly level base for the glass. And of course the glass is just going to be then, it was thin set directly on top of the limestone. Now this is a zero edge beam, and it has a gutter around the pool. I'm not going to discuss the gutter in any detail, but only to say that gutters can be very, very noisy, and acoustically can be a total disaster. I have a video somewhere where I've actually recorded the sound of the water, which sounded like it was in a cave or something when the water was being evacuated from the gutter. But the main purpose of showing you this pool is to give you some in-depth knowledge that this glass, to make sure that if you use glass, you do need to actually use a stone that you can grind or have it ground. And then on top of that, once you have that level and you flood test, because that's what happened here, then what you can do then is have the glass put on top of the limestone. In here, of course, the glass went on top of the actual gunite. Another just very brief comment here. What happened when they selected the glass tile is after they finished, the color from this reflected into the water, and they actually changed the color, and it was a mirror effect. So it just something to keep in mind, but it was quite a phenomenon. So again, any type of edge that you choose, you need to consider the edge what it needs. For example, this is glass and it needed to be perfectly level because the water ran around all 360 degrees of this design. And you also need to consider, not going to discuss it here, but waterproofing, making sure you have a waterproof vessel, because if you don't, you cannot possibly flood test it. So again, some very crucial details about negative edge materials. One thing to say about this is there are many different types of leveling devices on the market which tilers will use. In this project, they used a water level, which again, even with a water level, there are no guarantees of getting it perfectly level. Just another comment too. So let's talk about what happens after the pool's finished, and let's say that, for example, the pool shifts. Say it shifts a little bit, because that does happen. And sometimes one edge will actually be higher than another edge. If you have a limestone material, for example, that I mentioned earlier, then the limestone can actually be ground in the future. So if there is shifting, this pool particularly sat on 21 helical piles. And but if there is ever any shifting whatsoever, then this material can be ground and the level can be reestablished. This is half-inch tiles. So of course in the future if something really were to happen and there's a half-inch differential, then of course this tile will need to be replaced if it's being ground, and then maybe a thicker edge or something like that in its place. So the main thing is materials, and again flood testing, a very, very important aspect. But if you get to the end of the job, and at least if you finish the job, and something's wrong at the end, at least you know that this material can actually be ground. Now I want to show you something else here for a moment, briefly. It's not actually a negative edge, but just to emphasize the point.
Recording in progress.
So in this particular, this is really not a waterproof vessel. I can tell you that by the way the tiler has put on some of the waterproofing membrane just underneath the glass. But if you look at this spa spillway and you look here at 1 inch, 2 inch, 2.5 inch here, this is a perfect example of sometimes what tilers will do. And then take a look at this side and you'll see there is 1.5 or thereabouts, 1 3/4 glass tile. If you put a level on this surface, you're going to find that it looks level. It's very hard to detect that it's not unless it's counted from the glass tile. So this is an example of a problem area, and the only way to fix it is that the tiler has to remove all this glass tile and then refloat this area here to make sure it's level. But just to show you what occurs with tilers who really should know better when it comes to especially a spillway. This is a rolled beam here. It's a rolled beam at the back, and this is an armrest in a spa area with a step coming in. So it's a really basic, very, very basic pool. Not really anything elaborate, but just contemporary and very basic. So keep in mind that if you were to have a situation like this in a negative edge, and you finish the job without paying particular attention to how level this area is, then the only way you can solve the problem is you have to compensate by actually using a lot of water over the edge, which means that you would need to have had enough capacity in the pump to run the negative edge. So, and that's what sometimes builders do, is that when they have an edge and it's unlevel, they're just going to run more water over it to compensate for it. And this is very difficult because the homeowner ends up paying higher energy costs. There's much more evaporation. There is a lot more chemical loss as well. So not salt, because salt stays in the water, but a lot of chlorine, loss of chemicals. And compensating for a really poor negative edge, for example, with the level, by just running more water over the edge is a very poor substitute to making sure that the edge is level and starts off fairly close to level in the beginning. Maybe with a 1/8 inch tolerance is acceptable, but beyond that it should be reasonably level, and it should be flood tested as well to make sure that if there are any problems, they are resolved well before the actual pool is completed. So that's it for now, and I hope that you gained some knowledge about some of these pools that look absolutely beautiful. This particular one, I just want to say that all they did was I think the gallonage here on 360 degrees of 100 and the pool's 75 feet, so there's 150, and around a 200-foot perimeter pool is that Lou said he was running anywhere between 30 gallons per minute up to maybe 60 gallons per minute over this edge. The only way that could be remotely possible is by having that edge perfectly level. So that's it for now, and I think I answered the key questions: the edge, what it needs, what happens to the edges during construction with the tiler who's not paying particular attention sometimes, and how to know whether the edge is level. Obviously, waterproof the entire pool, waterproof the basin, make sure that you fill it and test it with a flood test. And if it's unleveled, then of course it can be very easily resolved with the right material. With limestone, maybe marble, for example, is also a very good material to use. Some types of dense flagstone or very dense fieldstone. Definitely don't use slate. Don't use any type of slate which has oil. Be very careful and conscious of whether there is oil in the stone, and definitely avoid some of any stones that are very dark and might stain the pool. And of course, how to know whether the edge is level and what can be done when it is not level. And of course, all of this is in the planning. So as long as you plan for it, as long as you're aware of the potential problems, and as long as you're aware of the best materials to use and what will give you that successful outcome.